There's a valley in rural Pennsylvania where the same 6 last names appear on every mailbox for over 200 years. The same faces, the same bloodlines, the same genetic code folding in on itself like a paper crane that never learned to stop. By the time scientists arrived in 1962, it was already too late to stop what had begun in 1744. They came looking for answers about heredity. What they found was a family that had become its own experiment. A closed loop of DNA so tightly wound that it had started to unravel in ways medical textbooks didn't have language for yet. The children born there weren't just cousins, they were echoes. Genetic mirrorings of people who had died a century before, walking around in new skin, carrying forward the same defects, the same silent mutations, the same invisible damage that no one outside the valley could see. This isn't a story about ignorance. It's about isolation so complete that it became inheritance, about a community that didn't just marry within itself, it consumed itself. Generation after generation, the family trees didn't branch. They circled, and what circles long enough eventually closes. The researchers who studied them gave the family a code name in their reports. They never used it in public. The ethics were too murky, the implications too dark. Because what they discovered wasn't just about one family in Pennsylvania. It was about what happens when a human population is left alone long enough to forget why certain rules existed in the first place. By the time the outside world found them, there were genetic markers in that valley that didn't exist anywhere else on Earth. Not because they were special, but because they were trapped, repeating, reinforcing, becoming more themselves with every marriage, every birth, every generation that looked into the mirror and saw only family. And the worst part, they didn't know. For over 2 centuries, they believed they were simply keeping their community strong, keeping their bloodline pure, keeping the outside world at a safe distance. They had no idea they were rewriting their own genetic code into something science had never seen before. The family called themselves the Rittenhouse line, though that name has been changed in every official document that still exists. What matters isn't the name. What matters is the number, 43. That's how many individuals founded the settlement in 1744. German immigrants, deeply religious, fleeing persecution and bringing with them a belief system that saw the outside world as corrupted, dangerous, spiritually poisoned. They bought land in a valley so remote that winter could seal them off for 4 months at a time. That wasn't an accident. That was the plan. They built their homes in a circle. They built their church in the center. And they built invisible walls around the entire community that were stronger than anything made of wood or stone. No one left. That was the first rule. And no one from outside was allowed to stay. That was the second. For the first 50 years, it worked exactly as intended. They were self-sufficient. They married within the community, raised children who married each other's children, and believed they were preserving something sacred. By 1800, the 70 families that remained were all descended from those original 43. The gene pool had already begun to shrink. By 1850, it had become a puddle. The first signs were subtle. Stillbirths increased, infant mortality climbed, but these were common enough in rural 19th century America that no one questioned it. What they couldn't ignore were the children who survived but shouldn't have. Children born with 6 fingers, children whose eyes didn't track correctly, children who seized without warning, whose bones fractured from nothing, whose blood didn't clot the way blood should. The community called it God's will. They prayed harder, they married closer. By 1900, every single person in the valley shared at least one common ancestor within 3 generations. Many shared 5. The family trees that researchers would later try to map looked less like trees and more like webs. Lines crossing and recrossing until it became impossible to say who was a cousin and who was a sibling and who was both. And still no one left, because leaving meant betraying the family, and betraying the family meant losing your soul. So they stayed, and they married, and they had children who had nowhere to go but back into the same genetic loop that had created them. By the time the outside world noticed, the damage was already written into their cells. Permanent, irreversible, passed down like an heirloom no one could refuse. The first outsider to document what was happening was a country doctor named Samuel Marsh. He arrived in 1931, hired to treat a tuberculosis outbreak that turned out to be something else entirely. What he found in that valley would haunt him for the rest of his life. He kept a journal. It still exists, locked in a university archive that requires special permission to access. The entries start clinical. Detached, by the third week, his handwriting begins to change. The words become heavier, more desperate. He stops using medical terminology and starts describing what he saw in language that belongs in a confession booth. He wrote about children with faces that looked decades old, skin that seemed translucent, eyes that didn't blink at the right intervals. He wrote about a 16-year-old girl who had the bone density of an 80-year-old woman. About twin boys who were born connected at the sternum and survived separation, only to both die of identical heart defects within hours of each other, years later, in separate houses. He wrote about visiting a family where 3 generations lived under one roof, and realizing halfway through the visit that he couldn't tell who was parent and who was child. The genetic similarities were so extreme that age became irrelevant. They all looked like variations of the same person, printed over and over with slight distortions each time. But what disturbed Marsh most wasn't the physical deformities. It was the silence. No one in the valley talked about it. Not to him, not to each other. They treated the boy with the twisted spine, and the girl who couldn't speak, and the man who had seizures every afternoon at 3 o'clock, as if this was simply how life was. Normal, expected, the cost of being family. Marsh tried to convince them to seek outside medical help, to let their children marry beyond the valley, to understand what was happening to them. They refused. Not with anger, with pity. They looked at him like he was the one who didn't understand, like he was the outsider who couldn't see that what they had was worth protecting, no matter the cost. He left after 6 weeks. He reported his findings to the state health department. They sent an inspector who was turned away at the valley's edge by men with rifles and Bibles. The matter was dropped. Officially, the community didn't exist. No census data, no birth records filed with the state, nothing that would require intervention. So the valley continued, closed off, feeding on itself, and Samuel Marsh spent the rest of his career trying to forget the faces he'd seen there. Faces that all looked like they were reaching back through time, trying to escape something that had already caught them. The breakthrough came in 1962, but it wasn't intentional. A graduate student named Ellen Kovacs was researching blood disorders in isolated populations for her dissertation. She'd heard rumors about the valley from another researcher who'd heard it from a retired county clerk who'd once processed a death certificate that didn't make sense. The cause of death was listed as familial, nothing else. Just that one word. Kovacs spent 3 months gaining the community's trust. She didn't arrive as a scientist. She arrived as someone interested in their history, their traditions. She attended their church, ate at their tables, and slowly, carefully, she began collecting blood samples, hair samples, family trees drawn on paper that the families themselves helped her construct. What she discovered would eventually be published in a medical journal under a title so deliberately vague that most people scrolled past it, but the data inside was anything but vague. The valley population had an inbreeding coefficient that exceeded anything recorded in human populations outside of extreme geographical isolation. The genetic diversity was so low that some individuals were more closely related to each other than typical siblings. The effective population size, the number of individuals actually contributing new genetic variation, was estimated at fewer than 12 people's worth of genetic material spread across 200 bodies. She found recessive genetic disorders that appeared in 60% of births, conditions that in the general population occur in 1 in 10,000. Here they were the norm: hemophilia, albinism, polydactyly, severe mental disabilities that left children unable to speak or walk, immune deficiencies that meant a common cold could kill. But the most disturbing findings weren't the disorders themselves. It was how they clustered, the same mutations appearing in predictable patterns across family lines, like a genetic echo that got louder with each generation. Kovacs realized she wasn't just looking at inbreeding. She was looking at a population that had been inbreeding for so long that natural selection had nearly stopped working. The usual mechanisms that weeded out harmful mutations weren't functioning anymore. Everything was being passed forward. Nothing was being filtered out. She documented cases of children born with combinations of genetic conditions that shouldn't exist together, shouldn't be survivable. But they survived anyway, for years sometimes, living in bodies that were genetic contradictions. The community still didn't see it as a problem. When Kovacs tried to explain what she'd found, they listened politely. And then they thanked her for her interest, and they asked her to leave, because to them this wasn't evidence of something going wrong. It was evidence of their faith being tested, and they had no intention of failing that test by letting the outside world in. Kovacs left with her data. She published her findings with all identifying information removed, and then she stopped researching human genetics entirely. In her final interview before she died in 2003, she said the valley taught her something she wished she'd never learned: that human beings are capable of enduring almost anything, as long as everyone around them is enduring it too. By the 1980s, the valley's population had dropped to 78 individuals, not because people were leaving, because they were dying. Infant mortality had reached 40%. Life expectancy had fallen to 52 years. And the children who did survive were increasingly born with conditions so severe that they required constant care. The community adapted the only way it knew how. It pulled tighter. Families combined households to share the burden of caring for the sick. The church became a hospital, the pastor became a nurse, and marriage, the thing that had caused all of this, became even more concentrated because there were fewer options now, fewer healthy partners, fewer viable genetic combinations. By this point, some families had produced 3 consecutive generations of children with the same genetic disorder, a hereditary blindness that set in before age 10. The community treated it as inevitable. They taught the children to navigate by sound before they lost their sight. They prepared for the darkness like other families prepare for winter. There were families where every child born had a cleft palate, where hemophilia was so common that sharp objects were kept locked away, where cognitive disabilities meant that some family lines simply stopped being able to care for themselves and were absorbed into other households, cared for by cousins who were also aunts, also grandmothers, also genetic mirrors of the people they were caring for. And still, the outside world barely noticed. The valley had become invisible, a geographic anomaly, a place that mail carriers avoided and where state services simply didn't reach. The few times social workers tried to intervene, they were met with legal challenges from lawyers the community had hired: religious freedom, parental rights, the right to privacy. Every legal shield available was used to keep the state at arm's length. But something had started to shift. A few of the younger generation had begun asking questions. Why did their siblings look different from other children in photographs they'd seen? Why did the pastor's sermons keep insisting that their suffering was holy when it felt like something else entirely? In 1987, a 17-year-old girl named Sarah, her real name was never published, did something no one in the valley had done in over a century. She walked out, 8 miles on foot to the nearest town. And she told a police officer that she needed help, not for herself, for everyone she'd left behind. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If everything you knew told you to stay, but everything you saw told you to run? The investigation that followed would finally force the valley into the light. But by then, the damage was generational. Cellular, written into the bones of children not yet born. The state intervention began in 1989. It took 2 years of legal battles before social workers were allowed into the valley with police escorts. What they found was worse than anyone had prepared for, not because of violence, not because of abuse in the traditional sense, but because of acceptance. The entire community had accepted this as normal. There were adults in their 30s who had the cognitive function of toddlers, cared for by siblings who themselves had debilitating physical disabilities. There were teenagers who had never seen a doctor because the community believed medicine was interference with God's plan. There were children who were going blind, losing their hearing, developing tumors that could have been treated if anyone had sought treatment. The medical examinations revealed patterns that geneticists are still studying today. One family line carried a mutation that caused progressive muscle wasting. Every member, no exceptions. They knew that by age 40, they would be unable to walk, and they had children anyway, passing it forward like a family recipe. Another family had a clotting disorder so severe that menstruation could be fatal. The women in that line married young, had children quickly, and died before 30, 3 generations in a row. The youngest daughter always knew she was next. And she accepted it because her mother had and her grandmother had, and everyone she'd ever known told her this was the price of keeping the family pure. The state wanted to relocate the children, provide medical care, introduce genetic counseling. The community fought back with everything they had. They hired better lawyers. They claimed religious persecution. They argued that their way of life was protected under the Constitution. And in many ways, they were right. There was no law against marrying your cousin, no law against having children with genetic disorders, no law that could force them to change, but the publicity changed everything. News crews arrived. Documentaries were proposed. Suddenly, the valley that had stayed hidden for 2.5 centuries was being discussed on national television. Geneticists wanted access. Anthropologists wanted to study them. The community became a spectacle, and that's when the real exodus began, not because the state forced it, but because the younger generation had finally seen what the outside world looked like. They'd seen children who could run without pain. Families where siblings didn't all share the same facial deformities. A world where genetic disorders were rare, not guaranteed. Between 1990 and 1995, 42 people left the valley, most of them under 25. They left behind parents, siblings, cousins. They left behind the only community they'd ever known, and they stepped into a world that looked at them with a mixture of pity and fascination and horror. The families that remained became even more isolated, more defiant. They saw the ones who left as traitors, as weak, as people who'd broken the covenant that had held the community together for over 2 centuries. By 2000, only 31 people still lived in the valley. The church had closed, the school had closed, and the genetic damage was so deeply embedded that even if they'd wanted to change course, it was already too late for most of them. The valley still exists. You can find it on a map if you know where to look. But the families are gone now. The last resident died in 2017, an 83-year-old man who had been born blind, lived blind, and refused every offer to leave. He died in the house his great-great-grandfather built, alone, the last living carrier of genetic markers that existed nowhere else on Earth. The researchers kept studying the bloodlines even after the community dissolved. They tracked down the ones who left, studied their children, and what they found was both hopeful and devastating. The genetic damage didn't disappear in one generation. It lingered, recessive genes hiding, waiting for the wrong combination to bring them back to the surface. Some of the children born to those who escaped the valley were healthy, but others weren't. A woman who'd left at 19 had a daughter with the same clotting disorder that had killed her mother and grandmother. A man who married outside the community still passed down the gene for early onset blindness. It skipped his son. It didn't skip his grandson. The valley had closed, but its genetic legacy was still unfolding, still echoing forward through bloodlines that had scattered across 3 states. Some of the descendants don't even know. They have no idea that the mystery illness that runs in their family has a name, has a history, has roots in a place their grandparents never talked about. The scientific community calls it the Rittenhouse effect now, though that's still not the real name. It's shorthand for what happens when a human population closes itself off so completely that it stops being a population and becomes an experiment, an unintentional study in what the human genome does when it has nowhere to go but back into itself. There are lessons here that no one wants to say out loud, about purity, about isolation, about what happens when we confuse keeping something safe with keeping something trapped. The families in that valley believed they were protecting their way of life. What they were actually doing was erasing it, slowly, genetically, 1 generation at a time. The buildings are still standing, the church, the houses arranged in that perfect circle. You can visit if you want. There are no signs, no historical markers, nothing to tell you what happened there. Just empty structures and overgrown fields, and a silence that feels heavier than it should. But if you walk through that valley, if you stand in the center where the church used to hold services every Sunday, you can still feel it, the weight of all those closed loops, all those family trees that turned into family circles. All those children born carrying genetic instructions written by people who died 100 years before them. The valley kept its secrets for over 2 centuries, and when those secrets finally came to light, they revealed something we're still trying to understand. That blood isn't just thicker than water. Sometimes it's thick enough to drown in. That family can be a refuge or a trap, and that the things we do to protect the people we love can become the very things that destroy them. The last thing Samuel Marsh wrote in his journal before he left in 1931 was a single sentence. He never published it, never shared it, but it survived in his papers, discovered after his death. They're not victims of their circumstances. They're architects of their own extinction, and they don't even know it. He was right, but by the time anyone understood why, there was nothing left to save. The valley is empty now, but the genetics are still out there, still waiting, still carrying forward the consequences of decisions made in 1744 by 43 people who thought they were building something that would last forever. They were right about that part, at least, just not in the way they intended.